Hello. 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 Hi. It's so hot here. It's 2 a.m. It's 80 degrees in my studio recording space. So if there's a computer fan, I apologize. I woke up sweating, so I'm awake. So I thought I would make a Jorbs talks about slides video because I haven't done this for a while, right? This is always comfortable. It's nice. I don't know. This one will probably not be very long. Um, I recently read a couple of examples of really good science communication, I thought, about the concept of nonlinear consequence. And I thought I could tell people this. Um, this is not super hard to understand, and it's very important. So, non-linear consequence. What does that mean? Why does it matter? Why does it interface in any way with me being awake at 2 a.m. because it's 80 degrees in here? Um, what is the value of each point of health in a game? I think most people who watch my channel probably instinctively, intuitively have a really good idea of the value of points of health in a game and how the value of each point of health changes in a way that is nonlinear. So it's often true in a game that it's worth more to have lots of health than to have little health. It's better to have 100 HP than 10 HP. 100 HP means you can soak some hits without dying. You can trade health for events, etc., etc., etc. You can build your deck differently because you'll have more time in a fight to set up and deploy. It's nice to have lots of health. It's a little bit less nice to have little health, generally speaking. But you probably have an entire different evaluation mechanism of health in your brain for when your health goes to zero. You jump off this idea of changing value of health, going from 1 to 100 to at 0 health, I just lose the game. That isn't a change in value of health that can be expressed in a linear fashion at all. You have gone from having some chance to win to having no chance to win. Often, if you're in a situation in Slay the Spire, your chance to win if you have 1 HP can still be quite high. You could be resting pretty soon, you could have potions that help, etc., etc., etc. Your chance to hit a run of Slay the Spire when you have 0 HP is 0. So all of your value from the run is gone, boom, just like that. And that could just be from losing 1 HP. Could just be from going from 1 HP to 0 HP, all of your value is gone. Done. Whereas if you go from 99 to 98 HP, a lot of people would not think that that change in health had almost any relevant value. A little bit, sure, but not a large amount by any stretch of the imagination. And probably easily expressed in a linear way, like going from 99 to 98 health is kind of comparable to going from 51 to 50 health kind of things. As you get better at the game, you'll notice that there are some other notes where health value is very nonlinear, and Slay the Spire going from 33 to 32 health can be a really big deal when you're about to fight Gremlin Nob, because Gremlin Nob attacks you for 32 in the first 3 turns. So all of a sudden you've lost an entire turn of survival. You could say that that's a slightly nonlinear change in the value of health. But note that the reason it was a slightly nonlinear change in the value of health was largely that it can let your health be 0 where it wouldn't be before. You've gone from a situation where your health would have gone to 1 and now it goes to 0. And that's where the nonlinear value is coming from in that situation. It's a really big deal for your health to go to 0. Very nonlinear change in value. And there are lots of other game situations where this is true as well. It's true of enemies' health in Slay the Spire. If the enemy's health is at 1, it still attacks you and kills you and everything, but if it goes to 0, the enemy's done. In poker, there's a very famous saying that all you need to win a tournament is a chip in a chair. The value of chips is nonlinear. And ways that people model the value of chips in poker assigns much more value to your first chips than it does to your excess chips. If you're in a poker tournament and you have 10 chips, those chips are worth a large amount each to you. Whereas if you have 1,000 chips, or 100 times the value of chips, maybe I should say, since chips can have different amounts of actual functional, like it can be $5 or $10 or whatever. Except it's not dollars, it's tournament dollars. This analogy, but um, if you have 100 big blinds worth of chips in poker, then losing 10 of them is not as big a deal as if you have 10 big blinds worth of chips in poker and you lose 10 of them and you're actually out of the tournament. This is generally understood by how people model the value of chips in poker, and also just sensible, yeah, to anyone who thinks about how the game works. So, okay, cool. That's in games. Nonlinear consequence exists in real life as well. Most of the things that you interact with in your life have some sort of nonlinear consequence somewhere. So, food availability. The availability of food to you could change in small increments up or down, probably for a long way. If you live in an abundant world with some amount of privilege and some amount of safety, um, the amount of food that you could choose from could go down by 50%, and you would still be able to feed yourself and be okay, and it would be all right. However, if the amount of food available to you eventually gets low enough that you're not able to get enough calories every day to be healthy, you'll start getting sick and then you will starve. Um, so that's a very non-linear consequence of the availability of food to you. Your age. It's easy to assign some like linear value to the changes on your body going from like 24 to 25 or something like that. A lot of people might think going, I think through the like 20s and 30s that the value of a year is somewhat linear to their age. But I think a lot of us do not think age is very nonlinear in our like childhood. We think that turning 18 is a massive thing, turning 21 is a massive thing, turning 16 is a massive thing in terms of like legally what you're allowed to do in society and also where you are in life. Like you're going to college, you're going to high school, you're graduating college and entering the job market, types of things. Um, and then on the other end of the age scale, like eventually you die. Our society places a very non-linear value on the age 65, if I remember right. I think that's still true because you start getting retirement out of Social Security, stuff like that. I'm not 65 yet. I don't know what it's like to be 65. But if you're thinking like each year is just as important as the last when you are like 80, um, I mean, I don't personally know many people that age who are thinking about age that way anymore. Um, Years start to become very precious because you're nearing the end of your life, and at the end of your life, you won't be here anymore. So, age like doesn't have linear value. Um, Support networks. If you have friends who you can rely on for things, that is really awesome. When you need help, you'll get help, and your support network can dwindle. But as long as you still have one person who you need help from, you can still get that help. But then, boom, the second that your support network's gone, you don't have support anymore. And we've seen that like in the pandemic with people losing apartments and places to live and so on and so forth. A lot of us through the pandemic have been in situations where if I can't pay for my apartment or if I get sick and can't work for a couple of weeks, so on and so forth, I have people who can support me. I have money saved. I have a safety net, which keeps me afloat anyway. And it's very easy for people in that situation to not recognize the nonlinear consequence of the breakdown of support networks. But if you look at how many people have ended up out of their homes because of the pandemic, um, unable to pay for their mortgage or their rent or what have you, losing their job, etc., you can see that there is a huge nonlinear consequence somewhere along that scale where suddenly you go from like stuff remains somewhat normal at least to life is drastically changing very rapidly because there isn't help anymore. Gas in your car is a more physical 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 in the way of physics um example where If you can afford to fill your tank of gas up, you can drive places. As your gas dwindles, you can still drive places. Eventually, your gas will run out and you can't get your car to go anywhere anymore. So if you can't afford gas to go to work, all of a sudden you actually just can't go to work, etc. And there's a thought-provoking question here. Why would consequence be linear after all when it could be literally any other thing other than linear? Like why? We do not generally see linear value distributions in nature often at all. You can assess the distribution of things in nature fairly easily using a few different statistical distributions. Like if you want a reasonable assessment of things in nature, there are like 6 distributions that show up all the time, kind of. Normal distributions, Poisson distributions, exponential distributions. Linear change would be represented by uniform distribution. Certainly uniform distributions exist, but you don't see a ton of uniform distributions anywhere in the world. They're just not that common, and there isn't that much reason why they would be. So, yeah, this means it's often hard to predict how the world will change if it goes another step in a certain direction, because we're sitting inside a system with nonlinear consequence. Often we're basing our understanding about what the consequence of another step in a certain direction might be on what the previous step in that direction was. But the system doesn't have linear consequence, and we don't always know where breaking points exist, and we can't always intuit that or discover that in any way. There are systems with nonlinear consequence that we just don't know where the nonlinear consequence exists. And that's true for us as people who are just going about our lives without thinking about it too much. But it also may be true for people who have been studying the thing their entire lives in academic capacity. So steps toward fascism or in the other direction toward equality, it's very hard for us to say where breaking points are there. We can see that sometimes societies become authoritarian and start committing atrocities. We can see perhaps that our society that we live in is in ways authoritarian and committing atrocities. We don't know exactly where breakpoints are, where the really major bad things happen. And in a similar way, in steps toward equality, we don't know how good it will be to take another step toward equality. It's really hard to see that like one more step and all of a sudden everyone's empowered. Everybody's like getting good value from their work, living comfortably. That means that they get to start building families, not necessarily like the Western nuclear family, but like families of people who they care about and support, going back to support networks, and see every day in their lives. And just another step in that direction could have much, much, much larger than linear consequence, but we don't necessarily see it. Stuff like that, you can maybe look at another country which has better support networks and better equality, but you don't really know that that's how another step is going to work in our country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or your country if you live somewhere else from me. I feel like most of this stuff applies. I mean, why would anything be linear? We don't know what happens if it gets a degree hotter. And this is a situation where even people who have been studying this for decades do not have certainty about what happens if it gets a degree hotter on our planet. The planet keeps getting a degree hotter. We don't even know what the consequence is of the planet having gotten a degree hotter already. We don't know in real time what the consequence is, and we don't know over the next centuries what the consequence will be. There are all sorts of nonlinear systems in nature where Arctic ice melt means that less of the surface of the planet is ice, which means less of the surface of the planet is reflecting heat from the sun and more of it is absorbing heat from the sun, because water will absorb heat from the sun more than ice does. Ice will reflect more heat from the sun. So all of a sudden, you have a feedback mechanism created through nonlinear change, consequential to the world getting slightly hotter, which is making the world hotter still. Um, we also don't know about a little bit less wealth inequality. We don't know this stuff. Um, People can argue about what the change could be. People who have studied these things might have fairly good ideas about what the change might be and might be able to make fairly strong arguments about them, but we don't know. And you can't extrapolate from what's happened before. It just doesn't work that way. So, a huge thing to realize about things with nonlinear consequence is that if a macro level change affects lots and lots and lots of people in the world, and the change that's occurring has potential nonlinear consequence, that change can be a really, really, really big deal while doing almost nothing to us. So the example of getting sick during COVID, for example, if I got sick during COVID, I would take a couple of weeks off. I'd be okay. Unless I had very severe COVID, in which case I was hurt going onward in my life personally. But like in terms of my situation in the world, I wouldn't have lost my job. I wouldn't have lost my house. I wouldn't have lost my friends. I would have been okay, most likely. But for some other people, a single bout of COVID is enough to lose all of their physical possessions, basically. Um, Similarly, with temperature, if temperature increased in steps of 1 degree in the room I am in right now, at first I wouldn't notice it that much. That's how it goes for me from like if it's 70 degrees in the room to 78 degrees in the room. I largely don't notice it at all. But then as it gets above a certain point, I start to get uncomfortable. So working in my studio, if it goes above 80 degrees, I notice it. I start to get a little bit uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. It doesn't hurt me in any way in particular yet, though, but it's unpleasant. When the temperature in my studio gets above 90 degrees, I start to actually see health consequences of it. I can't focus at my job anymore. I like play the game I'm playing worse. I Some people like me when I'm having fever brain, but like the things that I say are just kind of outrageous and all over the place, scatterbrained. And the only times that it's ever gotten hotter than 93 degrees in my studio that I've been working in a studio, I have like actually started to have heat exhaustion, like woken up the next day slurring my words and not sure what's going on. There's a point where it actually becomes very dangerous to my health. And this is a massive nonlinear consequence of temperature increase, which I've experienced the entire um, bandwidth of. I have worked in an office with limited air conditioning for like 7 or 8 years in different places. I could set up air conditioning here, but I haven't needed to. At the previous place I lived, I was on the third floor of an apartment building with direct sunlight, the top floor of an apartment building with direct sunlight, and I could not cool the room with air conditioning solutions that I found. Like I would have had to invest in a lot more air conditioning stuff to do it, but like there was heat coming in from the roof above me and from the wall that I was sitting next to, which was like if I touched the wall, it was warm on the inside. I was just getting straight afternoon sun all summer on the roof and wall, and it was too much for any heat solutions to work that I found. So I've experienced the entire scale of that, and I know exactly how it's nonlinear for me for this thing that I've done most days for the last 8 years or whatever, sitting in a chair and streaming at a computer. I know that the value of temperature changes going from like, honestly, it's largely linear for me from like 40 degrees up to 80 degrees. Often people will ask me, like, why are you wearing a sweater and a hat on stream? Couldn't you turn the heat on? But the reality is, like, I don't really notice any change if it's 40 degrees versus 70 degrees, other than that I wear slightly different clothes and it's not that big a deal. Um, When it gets below 40 degrees, I like to like close the window and put a blanket around me. I have a heated blanket that works great for that. But yeah, I've experienced all of this. I know exactly how temperature affects my day to day at my job, from temperatures below freezing all the way to like 95 degrees. I've never worked anywhere hotter than 95 degrees, but I did escape my studio and go hang out in my parents' air conditioned basement during a heat wave in Seattle one year. And when I came back, like things in my office had literally melted. So there is physical consequence past that. Sure. Um, I didn't have to sit through it in real time, fortunately. So anyway, I know that about how I interact with temperature, right? Something to realize about the world that we live in. There's tons of different people and situations different from us. There are tons of climates that are different from our local climate. There are tons of other species of like mammals and insects, and also there are tons of different types of trees and plants, and the world is full of lots of different stuff, right? So every time the temperature of the world increases by a fraction of a degree, some of that stuff is experiencing major nonlinear consequence. Um, a coral reef is completely dying. A glacier is evaporating. Um, a species is going extinct, or a species is changing its habitat. So an entire ecosystem may be migrating to a different place, which could then have follow-on effect on our lives if that ecosystem contains malaria carrying mosquitoes, for example, or something like that. Disease can spread to different areas where it didn't exist before. Crops which used to grow in one place can stop growing there and need to be grown in a different place, and farming systems can change. Rivers can dry up or change which direction they go, which can have massive consequence if we've built infrastructure around the idea that the river goes this way with this certain amount of water. Lakes can dry up. Lake Mead in Las Vegas is at the lowest that I've ever seen it. Um, and I mean, the lowest that it has been in all of the times that we have looked at it since we like built Las Vegas and the Hoover Dam. So, so really big, important things are happening. Massive nonlinear consequence as temperature increases by fractions of a degree over and over and over and over again, because temperature keeps going up and up and up and up. There's a really, 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 really brutal, I think perhaps the most effective data communication that I've ever seen about climate change. For me personally, given the background knowledge that I have going into seeing this graphic, I saw this graphic that was it plotted like the Paris Climate Agreement and everything, right? So we all hear these words about like, oh yeah, a climate agreement, that's cool. We hear about different ones going on and different reports releasing and stuff. So it had a list of all of these, which to me means fairly little, but it listed them on a graph that looked like this. It had CO2 parts per million, and it just keeps going up. It has been going up almost linearly for like 50 years or whatever. And then it had like, here was the Paris Climate Agreement. So you get to see that these things are having like absolutely no effect. Anyway, I digress, but I found that to be really brutal and effective data communication. Anyway, so CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere are just going up and up and up and up and up and up. And they're going up fairly linearly in our world and have been for a long time. But the consequences are nonlinear, and sometimes you see them on the news. But in your personal life, you don't notice anything. But the CO2 going up, you have to recognize that it's really bad every time it goes up a little bit, because something is experiencing grave, disastrous, nonlinear consequence. And the fact that it isn't you doesn't mean that it's like okay. It's really bad for a species to go extinct. That species has evolved for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years on our planet. It has all sorts of unique facets of life that we could study and learn from and understand. It may be valuable to its ecosystem and the species around it, allowing them to survive. It may be valuable to us as humans, allowing us to eat or enjoy ourselves or be safe from some other species, like an insect that preys on our crops or brings us disease or whatever. It's really bad for an entire species to go from being alive to not being alive. I feel like such a dumbass for saying that, because what an obvious thing to say. But somehow this isn't apparent viscerally to us in our day-to-day lives. Um, we don't grieve it. We don't react appropriately to how bad things are when certain things happen, etc., etc., etc. So, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, though. I just want people to think about nonlinear consequence in a better way. Just think about how bad changes with nonlinear consequences happening to other things which are unlikely to be us are on a grander scale. Because I think anybody who has found this video and is watching it is smart enough to do that. If you want to think about how bad it is for the world to gain 10 carbon ppm, CO2 ppm, I guess. For example, think about systems which are near grave nonlinear consequence instead of thinking about your own experience with linear consequence. You need to think about when something has nonlinear consequence and it's having nonlinear consequence on some of the things in our world which we care about and rely on and exist in the universe with, which gives them some type of value. You have to think about the things which are going from, not noticing anything to being uncomfortable, instead of thinking about yourself, where you have gone from wearing slightly warmer socks to wearing slightly less warm socks, but it's not a big deal to you at all. And you have to think about the things which are going from being slightly uncomfortable to actually actively unhealthy, not being able to function, falling apart. And you have to think about the things which are going from struggling really badly to actually just being dead. And if you're not one of those things, your experience of the consequence of whatever's happening isn't really that relevant because you're not the person who is experiencing the bad thing about the thing changing. Somebody else is, though. If the economy is getting a little bit worse, somebody else is experiencing the really bad thing about that, even though you are. You are not. So I think that if you think about that, and if you think about consequences of actions in that way, you can also think about how good things that you can achieve in the world can have nonlinear consequence and be tremendously important and worthwhile, even if you do not personally have your life massively change because of them. Working on stuff for charity or making changes in your local government or local community, which are good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that can have massive nonlinear consequence that you can have agency over. And even if it doesn't help you personally, it can help other people around you. But like really beyond like trying to say stuff is good or stuff is bad, really what I'm trying to do is just say like evaluate the thing in the right fucking way. Don't like just like things are something and try to be right about what they are. Don't be wrong. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll try to go sleep in my 80-degree bed now. Night, everybody.